The following is a sermon that was preached at Hope Lutheran Church in Manhattan, Kansas. For more information about our church or to watch and listen to past sermons from Hope, visit manhattanhope.com. Thank you for listening. Our gospel this morning comes from Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 56. Verses 45 through 52 will also serve as the basis for today's sermon. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. The Gospel of the Lord. I wonder if they felt like they should just give up. As they tried to row across the Sea of Galilee and they weren't able to get anywhere, I wonder if those disciples thought they should just quit. If they thought they should just throw in the towel, just surrender. Let the wind, let the waves overtake them. And part of the reason I wonder that is because this isn't the only thing that happened that day. It's really easy for us to forget because we've been looking at Mark chapter 6 over the course of the last few weeks. But everything from Mark chapter 6, verse 30 to where we are today, that all happened on one day. You remember back a few weeks, Jesus had sent his disciples out on this little missionary journey. He had sent them out 2 by 2, and they had come back and they had reported to Jesus everything that had happened, how they had preached and taught and driven out demons and all of these different things. And it had gone pretty well. Mark didn't record it for us, but the other Gospels tell us that in the meantime, while they were out on that mini missionary journey, the disciples also learned about something that had happened. John the Baptizer had been killed. This servant of God, this person who a lot of them knew, this one who was a relative of Jesus, this one who had done so much for the kingdom of God, for preaching and teaching to people, he had been killed, he had been put to death. So, disciples come back from their mini missionary journey. They learn that John the Baptizer has been killed. And then it says that Mark told us they were so busy, there were so many people coming to them that they didn't even have a chance to eat. And Jesus recognized it and he said to his disciples, "All right, we're just going to go away for a little while. You've been really busy. We're going to go mourn the death of John the Baptizer. Let's just go be alone for a while. Let's get some rest." But then maybe you remember what happened. The crowds saw Jesus and the disciples leaving, and they ran around the lake to meet them on the other side. And so this time of rest that they had planned didn't actually get to happen. And Jesus looked out at this crowd of thousands, and what did he do? It said he had compassion on them. His heart went out to them. And so he and his disciples ministered to people all throughout the day. They cared about them. They preached and they taught, and Jesus no doubt healed and did miracles. But that wasn't enough. Because then what happened after Jesus had met the spiritual needs of these people, after he had preached, after he had taught? Then you have the feeding of the 5,000. That must have taken hours. That must have been a ton of work to have all of that food distributed to all of those people, 5,000, and that's just the men. Might have been a group of 10,000, 15,000 people. How many hours does it take to distribute that much food to a crowd that big? So you have all of that. All of those different things. The disciples coming back from this mini missionary journey. The disciples not actually getting a chance to rest. Hearing about John the Baptizer's death. The feeding of the 5,000. All of that on one day. And then this. They're out at sea. And they can't get anywhere. And I was trying to imagine what it would have been like to be the disciples in this kind of a situation. A lot of them were fishermen. And I wonder if some of them thought, as they got into the boats, we can finally take a breath. We can finally relax. I kind of imagine it like when you get in your car after a long day at work, and you're just ready to kind of not think for a little bit as you drive home. And it's actually kind of a peaceful time most days. But then imagine if you got in your car after a long day of work, after the longest day of work, and as you're driving home, you get a flat tire. That would kind of be the cherry on top, wouldn't it? And so here are the disciples, after what may have been one of the longest days of their lives, probably one of the longest days since they started following Jesus, and they're ready to finally get away, and then this happens. A storm. Wind so strong that they can't even row against it. They're stuck in the middle of the lake, not getting anywhere. And so I wonder, were they ready to just call it quits? Were they ready to just throw in the towel? Were they ready to just go back and stop following Jesus? Do you ever feel like you're ready to give up? Do you ever feel like you're ready to just call it quits? Because sometimes it can just start to feel like it's too much, can't it? You have so many things going on in your life. Maybe you're having a whole bunch of long days in a row, and then all of a sudden a storm hits on top of it all. And you're trying to get out of it. You're trying to handle everything as best you can. You're doing everything you can to get out of the storm, to right the ship, but it feels like you're not getting anywhere. You're like those disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. That can feel kind of like torture, can't it? That's actually the word that Mark uses there when he talks about them straining against the oars. It's torture. It's punishment. Sometimes it can feel like you're rowing and you're rowing and you're rowing, but you're not getting anywhere. And the fatigue is starting to set in. You're starting to feel drained. You can feel the energy just leaking from your body, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's starting to feel unbearable. It's starting to feel like torture. And maybe you're ready to just throw in the towel. And that's just in our own lives. Our own lives can be so busy and then crazy and chaotic, and there can be storms in our own individual lives. But then, my goodness, the last month has just felt like a storm, hasn't it? Felt crazy and chaotic as you look at different things that are going on in the world around us. So we have our own personal storms. There's storms all around us. And it can just start to feel like a lot. Those disciples, I know they were terrified. I know they were terrified of the sea. I know they were terrified of the wind. I know they were terrified of the storm. And so I wonder, were they ready to call it quits? I wonder, were they ready to just give up? Because it'd be easier to just do that. But I also wonder if they remembered why they were out there to begin with. It's really easy to miss, but it's right at the start. What did Mark say as he started the account? He said, immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him. Those disciples weren't there because they had chosen to be there. Those disciples weren't there because they had made a bad decision. Those disciples weren't there because they had done something wrong. They were there because they were doing exactly what Jesus had asked them to do. Jesus had asked them to go out into the lake. Jesus had sent them out there knowing that a storm would eventually come, that the wind was going to come. It got them stuck. Listening to Jesus got them stuck and fighting for their lives in a crazy, a chaotic, a confusing situation. Jesus tells us to go out too. We have to go out. We can't just stay in a bubble. We can't just stay to ourselves. No, we go out into the world. We go and we live in the world. And Jesus sends us out into the world. And that can be crazy. That can be chaotic. That can be confusing. Today we're wrapping up this series that we've been moving through, this meaningful ministry series. We've been reflecting and considering how Jesus sends us out into the world to serve our neighbors, to love our neighbors, to meet our neighbors where they're at, and maybe somewhere along the way share the word of God with them. And you know what? That can be a scary thing to do. That can be terrifying, especially when you put on top of it all of the different things that I have going on in my life and you all have going on in your life. That can be scary and crazy and chaotic and confusing. But here's the thing, Jesus doesn't send us out without knowing what's going to happen. He's got a plan and he's got a purpose behind it all. Maybe by sending me out into the storm, he forces me to rely less and less on myself and more on him. Maybe he refines my faith in ways that I would have never chosen on my own. Maybe he sends me out and I get the opportunity to watch and see as God works in the heart and in the life of a person that I never would have expected or met on my own if it were just something I wanted to do, if I had just stayed cozy and comfortable on the shore. Jesus was the one who sent those disciples out into the sea, out into the storm. Jesus sends you and me out into the sea and maybe sometimes out into the storm too. But that doesn't mean Jesus leaves us alone. That doesn't mean Jesus has forgotten about us. He's still paying close attention to you, wherever you are, whatever storm you're in the middle of right now. So those disciples, they were rowing and they were rowing and they were rowing. Weren't getting anywhere. I can only imagine what their shoulders were starting to feel like as they're rowing against the wind for hours and hours and hours. And now it's the middle of the night, 3 or 4 in the morning. They left at evening, maybe 8 hours, 10 hours of rowing. And I wonder if some of them were thinking back to how Jesus had sent them out there. How Jesus had been the one to send them out into the sea, had sent them out into the storm. And so, I wonder, were they a little bit annoyed with Jesus for sending them out there to begin with? Were they wondering where Jesus was? Maybe some of them were thinking, Jesus forgot about us. It was going to happen sooner or later, and it just happened to be in this moment. But that's not even close to what had happened, right? Mark writes, after leaving them, Jesus went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on the land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Those disciples who probably thought they were alone, those disciples who might have been tempted to think that Jesus had forgotten about them and just left them to go attend to his own issues, Jesus was there. He never lost sight of them. He never missed them. He's standing on the shore and he sees them. He sees them in their struggle. He sees them in their chaos. He sees them in the confusion and the craziness. And he doesn't just see them. What does he do next? He walks right out to them. He walks on top of the thing that scared them the most. He walks step by step on top of the thing that was causing the most fear, the most anxiety, the most chaos and confusion for them. Jesus walks on top of it like it's nothing. And he walks right up to them, right in the middle of the sea, right in the middle of the storm. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. Jesus doesn't forget about us either. When we're in the middle of the lake, when we're in the middle of the storm, it might be easy to think Jesus has forgotten us, that he's just left us to handle it on our own. But know that Jesus, he sees you. In whatever struggles you're going through, in whatever season of life you're in right now, Jesus sees you. And then he walks out to you. He meets you right where you are. He walks on top of all of the things that make life crazy and chaotic and confusing. He walks on top of them like they're nothing. He's already walked over the worst things. He's already walked over sin and death and the devil. He's trampled them. And that means he can walk on top of every last one of our fears as well, everything else as well. Jesus walks on top of them all, and he comes to you. And he can do that because of who he is. Because he's not just another man. He's not just a really wise person. He's so much more than that. And you see that in the few words that Jesus speaks in this account. He doesn't speak much, but the words Jesus does speak here, they tell us so much about who he is and why he can do what he's doing. Mark writes, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Now, the way Jesus talks there might sound a little funny to us. I don't walk into a room and announce myself and say, "It is I." It doesn't really sound very good. It's not very good English. And so, I get what the translators are trying to do here, because it's really hard to express in English what Jesus is saying. But a better way to see this or read this is Jesus saying, "Take courage, I am. Don't be afraid." And if you know anything about the Old Testament and the way God chose to reveal himself to his people in the Old Testament, what was the name he told them to call him by? I am. So in effect, what is Jesus doing here? He's saying, I am. I am the Lord, the God, the maker of heaven and earth, the one who has created and now sustains all things, the one who rules over all things. I am God. I am the Lord. I'm God in the flesh. And because of who he is, he can say something like, "Take courage. Don't be afraid." And it can actually happen to people. He can say something like, "Take courage, don't be afraid," because he's God who's standing on top of it all, who holds it all in the palm of his hand. And his disciples actually can take courage. They actually can stop being afraid. And to show them that he means what he says, to show them that he is the Lord who's got this all in his hands, what does he do? He steps into the boat. He gets into the boat with them, and that's the moment that the storm ceases. That's the moment when they know it's all going to be okay. When Jesus gets in the boat with them. When the Lord gets in the boat with them. He's showing them that the Lord, the God, the maker of heaven and earth, is going to be with them no matter what. And that means they can go forward. They can take courage. They don't have to be afraid because God is in the boat with them. You and I can have courage too. You and I don't have to be afraid. When we feel like we're ready to give up, when we feel like we're ready to call it quits, we can continue because the Lord, who's already walked on the water and all of the things that make life hard and difficult, he's in the boat with you. He'll always be in the boat with you. And that means that we can leave this place and go into the world and live as God's people. We can partake in meaningful ministry as we serve and love other people. And we don't have to be afraid. We can take courage as we do that because we're not going out alone. Oh, Jesus who calmed the storm, Jesus who controls and has all things under control. He goes with you every single step of the way. He's in the boat with you. And that means he's going to take you across to the other side. And eventually he'll take you all the way across to the other side. He's going to take you to heaven. But because he's in the boat with you right now, that means you can enjoy the ride along the way. Amen.